Rights are recognized as things that we can and must do to survive and maximize potential.
I think rights are force.
Absolutely not. You're completely wrong.
No, I'm completely right.
I think you're making a postmodernist argument for why you should be allowed to do things that other people don't want you to do.
What you're doing, when you say a right, and you're appealing to, like, the Constitution, that's postmodernist subjective standards of nonsense, right?
I don't know if you're unwilling to understand or what.
Where do you make the assertion that you're not allowed to do X other than because Tim Pool's preference is that you don't?
Welcome back to Rattlesnake TV, guys. In this video, we're going to be reviewing a fascinating debate between Andrew Wilson and Tim Pool regarding the topic of rights. What are rights? Where do they come from? And in this one, there's a really interesting dynamic because Tim Pool is a pretty staunch libertarian, and the challenges and questions that he poses to Andrew allow the conversation and the debate to be really fleshed out in a way that is palatable for everyone. And honestly, I think that this is the sort of thing that makes people who are decent at critical thinking reconsider their presuppositions about the notion of rights. So let me know your thoughts on this one in the comments as we go. I'd be fascinated to read what you guys think and see which angle you take with this. Anyways, this one ends in a way that is very fascinating, where Andrew brings Tim Pool around, or at least plants the seed for Tim Pool to reconsider the way he thinks about this topic. So without saying any more, let's get into it.
Let's look at this objectively too. This idea of rights as a United States citizen, these are really just constructions of the mind. There's no such thing as an actual right. It doesn't exist outside of some axiomatic kind of philosophical principled belief, right? I have the axiom that I have inalienable rights, and so therefore I have them.
Disagree.
Okay, and we can get into that in a second. But to finish my point, okay, based on this, we kind of suspend them all the time and then kind of pretend like we don't. We let cops be judge, jury, and executioner in many moments and kind of excuse them from it. If there's something which is going on that's in such a state of emergency, we'll suspend the constitutional rights of people in a moment's notice. We'll send the Japanese to internment camps. We will do all of those things because we've done it. We'll suspend your constitutional rights in a second if we think we need to, which, by the way, that would be my argument for how I know rights aren't real anyway. But we will, and we just kind of excuse it.
But there's a correction here. Government-enshrined protections are not real. Rights that as we know them, are just things that we recognize as things of value to us. So, for instance, I usually define it as simply, you have a right to speak freely. If you're in the middle of the woods and you're buck naked, you can say whatever you want. You have a right to keep and bear arms. Pick up a stick, sharpen it, pointy stick, you can defend yourself. Ain't no one going to stop you. The question is, when you get into conflict with someone else, where is that line drawn? So the reality is, rights are recognized as things that we can and must do to survive and maximize potential.
I think rights are force, and I think that...
You think rights are force?
Government
yeah,
protections.
What do you mean rights are force?
You're talking about government protections.
No, I'm talking about period. I'll explain what I mean. A right, to me, is an entitlement absent duty. That's a right. Okay, you're entitled to it, but you have no duty.
What does that mean?
It means that you have it. So, like, okay,
entitlement to speak.
Yeah. So if you have a right to own a gun,
to speak.
No, hang on. Let me finish. If you have a right to own a gun, do you have a duty to own a gun?
But do you have a duty to speak?
No, you don't have a duty to speak.
If you have a right to vote, do you have a duty to vote?
So right. So it'd be an entitlement.
That's your argument.
It's an entitlement.
But
absent a duty.
But you can speak.
Yeah, you can.
And so
until you can't,
the question,
until somebody stops you with force.
So you're talking about government restrictions are made up by us as a people.
Just people can adhere to your rights without any form of government. If you're walking down the street and you speak, and a guy turns around and smacks you in the mouth and breaks your jaw, right? He has now used force against whatever this right you think you have to speak. You have no right to do shit except whatever you can enforce. Right. Your mechanism is force, and the mechanism against you is force. And so all rights are force.
You're talking about government protections, not rights.
No, I'm talking about rights. What is a right?
So it is an intrinsic moral function.
Well, okay, intrinsic meaning what?
It means if again, I'll try to explain. If you're born and you live in the middle of the woods, there are things you can do. You can hunt for food. You can defend yourself. You can speak freely. Now, what we've done in the United States,
unless you're born blind and you can't talk. Right? Then where does your right to speak come from?
You lack the ability to speak,
right?
But you still have the means by which you are allowed to do it.
Yeah, but what makes it an intrinsic right to be able to do? Like, where does this idea come from other than you axiomatically kind of just say, you say because I can do something, I have the right to do something?
It's part of a evolutionary biological structure that resulted in the survival of humanity.
So if I like grab a spear and I can stab somebody with it, I have a right to?
No,
No,
that's
Why?
that's attacking
different.
somebody. That's violating.
but other
that's a
than
whole
an
bunch-
axiom of you shouldn't do that because I just don't feel like you should, what makes it intrinsic that I don't do that?
that you don't go and kill another person.
Yeah.
So the way I view rights would be things that, and again, there's a debate over what rights are.
Yeah, let's start with that. What are they?
No. So there, it's honestly difficult to define,
Yeah.
but it is certain moral structures or.
I would
things
say
that are-
axioms. Would you agree with that? Just an axiom. So, like, you have inalienable rights from God according to the Constitution. This is an axiomatic principle. It means this is our like philosophical starting point. Is that we have these.
I would put it as things that were required or greatly beneficial to the survival of an individual that we greatly benefit.
I agree. I agree. We
it's-
benefit. I just don't know what makes them intrinsic, or like you're born with them, or something like this. Other than we just kind of agree to it.
Guys, just letting you know that you have an entitlement absent duty to like this video and subscribe to the channel. So I'd really appreciate it if you could use the enforcement mechanism that is either your finger or your mouse to just smash that like button and subscribe to the channel. Back to the video.
So I think the restrictions we kind of agree to. And some people might view some things as rights and other things not as rights. Like the left thinks healthcare is a human right, which makes literally no sense.
No sense.
But in terms of your ability to speak, you can walk around, you can speak. To defend yourself, you can pick up a stick, you can defend
But
yourself.
this goes back to the same argument. I can grab a spear and murder somebody. I can do that. Why don't I have a right to do that?
Because you are now causing harm to another person, which is a detriment.
But why is that valuable?
Why are other people valuable?
Yeah, well, why would that be an intrinsic value? So, like, I can
one would result in the end of humanity, and one results in the expansion of humanity.
Well, no, both can result in the expansion of humanity.
Right, but absolutely not. You're completely wrong.
No, I'm completely right.
You are wrong. Self-defense can result in expansion of humanity if you're using destruction for the purpose of ending something that is destructive. But if you are wantonly going around murdering people, you're actively reducing and harming humanity.
Well, okay, but that doesn't mean
So
that you couldn't expand humanity by harming people. There's
So
nations
the argument
that do
of
this all the
self-defense
time.
is there are things that we believe we must be able to do for the betterment and survival of humanity.
Yeah, but when I'm asking you this question, right, I'm asking the foundation from which you say, I have the right to speak or write.
We
or
need to be able to in
things like
order to
this.
survive.
You because you need to do something.
So
I'm not sure how that means you have a right to it, though.
Okay, so speech is not
Like you have
just
to
saying
eat.
words.
You have
Speech
a
is-
right to eat.
Yes, 100%.
Really? You have a right to do that?
Why would you
Yes,
not
you don't have a right to own
do
So
that?
if I have,
but you have a right to eat, otherwise you'll die.
Yeah.
I don't understand.
Do you have a right to breathe? What about breathing?
These are good questions. Right?
Again, I don't think you understand. We're talking about intrinsic behaviors that are required for survival versus the government and humans deciding what we shouldn't have.
I
on
don't think we're
laws.
speaking past each other. I'm asking what makes them intrinsic. When you say I have a right to eat, okay?
If you don't, you'll die.
If you have if that guy has all the food over there, you no longer have a right
We're not
to eat.
talking about your right to steal from others. If you
Yeah,
are
so you
standing
no longer
in
have
the
a right
woods
to
by
eat?
if you're standing in the woods by yourself, eat that mushroom.
Okay, got it. You can eat the mushroom. But what makes it a right to eat that mushroom, and what makes it not a right for guy standing next to the mushroom to say,
Okay, we're
I have a
talking- we're talking
gun
about
and
laws.
I don't want
Okay,
you
wait,
to
hold
eat
on.
that mushroom?
You're now once again talking about laws and restrictions.
Yeah, okay, but my whole theory is that rights themselves are force, and that's all they ever are. It's just your ability to use force to do thing you want to do.
I think you're just making
you call
an
that a
argument
right.
about-
So the first time I heard Andrew make this argument, I'll be honest with you guys, I thought that this was some sort of an authoritarian justification for imposing your worldview on people. By trivializing or downplaying the notion of rights, human rights, etc., in order to pave the way for squashing liberalism and cultural degeneracy with force. However, once I looked a little bit more into it, I realized that what he's doing is actually challenging our fundamental axioms or presuppositions around concepts such as rights in a philosophical sense. But in order to understand what's going on here, we have to understand that Andrew's not saying what we should or shouldn't be able to do. He's simply questioning the idea of rights. What are rights? How do we know when we see one? How can they be properly defined and identified? Where do they come from? And Andrew's position is that rights are entitlements absent duty, and that rights as we know them are simply force, and they can be taken away and given by whoever wields the sword, which I don't think Tim really seemed to grasp. So for example, with gun rights in America, You have an entitlement, you're entitled to own a gun, but you don't have a duty to own a gun. You are, for the most part, with exceptions, entitled to vote in America, but you don't have a duty to vote. And I think that that definition essentially sums up constitutional rights. However, if you are in Cambodia in 1977 and the Khmer Rouge comes into town and says, hey, listen, actually, you don't have the right to speak anymore. You don't have the right to food or clothes, or you don't have the right to bodily autonomy or freedom. We're going to put you in this prison. We're going to starve you, torture you, and probably kill you. So then in that situation, where are these inalienable rights? Tim's argument, however, is that rights are things that we need in order to be able to live. Rights are things that we ought be able to do. He's making an ought claim about how things ought to be, whereas Andrew is making an is claim about how things are. Now, I'm pretty sure from Andrew's Orthodox Christian worldview that he believes that people ought to be able to live, to breathe, to eat, to defend themselves, etc., albeit from a position of divine command rather than the arbitrary social construction of rights. It's good to have all of those things. People ought be able to have all of those things. However, without the mechanism of force, then you simply don't have this right to them. You may think that you have the right to bear arms, but only because you have the enforcement mechanism of the United States of America behind you. If you live in Australia, however, the enforcement mechanism enforces that you do not have that entitlement.
It was the biggest gun buyback the modern world had seen, and so controversial a newly elected John Howard wore a bulletproof vest after announcing it.
It will add to the overall safety and good of the Australian community.
Even though if people like myself believe that we should be able to do that, we can't. So therefore, we don't have that right. The question as to whether we should be able to do certain things and whether rights are a material reality are two very different questions. The debate continues.
I call rights things that are essential to the survival of humanity.
Do you have a right to your heart beating and your blood flowing and to blink and to...
Yes.
Okay, so if you
So now you misunderstand because once again, you're talking about government again.
How is this government? It doesn't need to be government.
If you are standing in the middle of the woods and your heart is beating, your heart has a right to beat. If your heart fails and you die, you died. If you're making an argument that someone should or should not be allowed to do something is an entirely human social construct.
I agree.
Right. I'm saying that the reason we have protections of rights is because we've determined certain things are required for the reasonable survival and expansion of humanity.
Now, I agree. We agree to those things, and we act as though they're rights.
And the Bill of Rights.
But I don't think rights themselves exist.
The Bill of Rights is a recognition of certain things that we do for the betterment of survival that must be protected from government. Now, if you want to argue the amendments in the Bill of Rights are nonsensical, fine. If you want to have a moral argument or philosophical argument about what is required or intrinsic to the survival of humanity, by all means have that argument. But rights do exist. It just means some you might not agree with and some you might think aren't. Those are philosophical debates.
Yeah, but when you say exist, right? Do you mean outside of your brain they exist, or do they only exist as a construction of your mind where you say, I have a right to do X?
If we observe creatures in the wild, we will see them required to do things to survive.
Yeah, okay, so...
If you inhibit those things, they will die.
So if just rights
protect
to you,
those things.
So the rights to you just mean things which are a requirement for your existence?
And typically we define them as such because they transcend the basic obvious things like breathing and drinking water.
Owning a gun isn't a requirement to your existence.
No, defending yourself is.
Yeah, but
if a bear comes and you're in the middle of the woods and you don't have the ability to defend yourself, you cease to exist and humans cease to exist. So humans do defend themselves. Then as human society, we've decided this should be protected, otherwise humans will cease to exist.
Yeah, but why? Okay, but this makes no sense, right? So if all right is to you, Tim, is thing X which is necessary for the survival of a man, in this case blinking and breathing and eating and pooping and whatever, the right to poop shall not be under, because you have a right to do that because it's like something you need to do to be alive.
Right, but you can't poop on someone's floor.
Why couldn't you extend that to literally everything? You need healthcare to survive. You need guns to survive. You need a house to survive. You need everything to survive.
I think we should move on, but I think the challenge is, I don't know if you're unwilling to understand or what. You have no right to take other things from other people, to take their labor. You have no right to force a doctor to perform surgery on you, but you certainly have a right to ask him for it.
Those are just assertions. Like, you just assert these things as though they have a grounding epistemic foundation from which you can make the assertion. Based on where do you make the assertion that you're not allowed to do X other than because Tim Pool's preference is that you don't?
And I'm literally saying you're talking about laws and social order right now, not human behaviors for survival.
I think human behaviors are laws and social orders. I think that's this. You're saying the same thing.
No, if a person was in the middle of the woods, they'd be foraging and looking for food.
Yeah, what does that have to do with what I just said?
You're talking about what the government can and can't do. I'm talking about what humans need to do to survive.
Yeah, okay. Well, humans also have to have other humans around to survive.
And so this is communication is essential. The right to defend yourself is essential. The right to secure your possessions is essential. These things, without them, humans cease to function properly. And then you get the Soviet bloc, you get starvation, you get genocides.
It's
and
also
this is a detriment to...
It's a function of our belief system in the United States that we have natural rights. I mean,
I agree with that.
That's a huge part of it.
I agree with that. I agree with that, that in the United States, we agree that we have them.
You can say, I think you can
not
say that
sure that
everyone,
we do.
I think that you can say that everyone has these rights, and it's a function of whether or not their government allows the rights to be recognized.
That's the contention. When you say, I think everybody has these rights.
Yeah, that is my belief.
Yeah, it's a belief.
Yeah.
Based on
existence. I mean,
based on just your preferences.
So there's,
I don't think it's a preference. I think everyone has a right to breathe. And
you do. In the big picture of what are the list of fundamental rights that exist to humans, cultures debate these things wildly, but there are a small handful which are true and correct. If inhibited, a person dies.
Agreed. But what I'm saying, I guess my overarching point, and I can just kind of tie it off
society
with this,
fails.
Is that when I say rights are forced, what I'm saying is the thing that you say is necessary, breathing, eating, these types of things. I think that those things, which you call rights, really are just force. You're saying I will use force in order to do this thing that I want to do to necessarily exist. And that another person can use force to stop those things from existing.
And then you can use force to stop them.
Right, and then you can use force, et cetera, et cetera.
Right,
but all we're really doing is just moving the goalpost of force around, right? So if this group says this group does not have the right to breathe, they do not have the right to eat, they do not have the right to do any of this shit, and they go and put a stop to it,
but you don't,
what are we appealing to for why it is that you can't do that?
That group doesn't have the right to do that.
Yeah, but that makes no sense.
Like
why wouldn't they have the right to do that?
I feel like
saying might makes right, which is
it's beyond that. I think you're making a postmodernist argument for why you should be allowed to do things that other people don't want you to do.
I think no, I think the opposite is true.
I
would use a justification of God. And I would appeal to something which is unchanging and an unchanging standard for moral justifications for oughts. But what you're doing when you say a right and you're appealing to like the Constitution, that's postmodernist subjective standards of nonsense, right? It's just like
no, it's moral
we
foundation.
all decided that we have these rights, so we do. There's no justification for any of them.
So as you can see here, the conversation goes further and further down the rabbit hole of what a human right is. And as the conversation's going on, it's playing more and more into Andrew's favor in the sense that rights are simply an arbitrary social construct made by human beings. And just to go for a slightly different angle here, take some of the issues of rights that are espoused by the radical left, for example. They will sit there all day long and scream from the mountaintops that healthcare is a human right.
Healthcare is a right of all people, not a privilege.
That trans rights are human rights, whatever the hell that means. That women have the right to an abortion, and that falls under the category of this broader umbrella topic of women's rights. Race activists will tell you that African Americans have a right to reparations. They'll tell you that white people don't have the right to speak on certain matters because they're not black. With the issue of free speech, it's enshrined in the Constitution that you have free speech in America. Until, of course, a big tech company wants to come and silence you. Or you criticize somebody who has more power than you, and then they come after you and they can silence you as well. Or you might live in the UK and you leave a Facebook comment that criticizes another person with more power than you, and then you're in prison.
arresting you on suspicion of improper use of the electronic communications network. Okay, this is in relation to some comments that you've made on a Facebook page.
And this is why I think that this conversation is kind of important, because the notion of rights is something that we throw around these days with very little consistency. And when you dig a little bit deeper, it's not really something that people can necessarily articulate very well, but rather people just assert it. So we should be questioning why it is that we believe what we believe and maybe define our terms a bit better. It's actually a really good example of how to use the Socratic method to develop our critical thinking skills. On to the last part now, which is very interesting, where they actually get to the bottom of where they both believe rights come from.
So you don't believe in any intrinsic moral foundations?
No, I do believe in intrinsic moral foundations and epistemic justifications and ontological justifications, which would come from God.
I think you're doing deconstructivist reasoning to argue why.
It's just basic philosophy. It has nothing to do with deconstruction or postmodernism. Basic philosophy, you have to have a justification for a position.
And when I've given you one, you just reject it every time.
Yeah, well, because they're axiomatic. So you haven't demonstrated why the axiom or the starting point. We start with rights, Andrew. You haven't demonstrated why we do, other than because I observe that if we don't act in this way, you expire. But it's like, okay, but why is that even bad? Like, why is that even a bad thing?
Why is it bad that humans cease to exist?
Yeah, why would that even be a bad thing from the worldview of rights? Like, oh, okay, if you don't have this right, you die. But you haven't justified why that's even a bad thing.
Because humans exist through a pattern of evolution towards, or creation, whichever you decide, to be fruitful, to bear fruit, and etc. These things are components of creation and life. I think this aligns perfectly with like a Christian, Judeo-Christian moral worldview, and I think these things are requirements for the efficient expansion and fruitfulness of humans. So they are natural. Either from an evolutionary standpoint, humans developed to inherit certain requirements to function efficiently. And when these things are curtailed, we see inefficiency and collapse, disease and chaos.
This is circular. So you go, okay, we need to bear fruit and multiply. Why? Well, because then we can exist. Why do we need to exist? Because then we can bear fruit and multiply. Okay, but why? Because then we can exist.
You're just being contrarian for no reason.
No, it's not contrarian. I'm giving you a real principle.
You believe in God?
Yeah, I'm a Christian.
So if I say God gives you a mandate,
Christian.
so when God says has a mandate to be fruitful and multiply, do you say yes or no?
Yeah, of course.
Are there certain characteristics and behaviors that result in benefit and in more efficient, fruitful multiplying?
Of course.
That's
divine, but this is divine command. Justification from divine command has nothing to do with libertarian nonsense of constitutional egalitarianism.
I think instead of having a discussion on the merits of what rights might mean, you're instead upset over what libertarians think rights might mean, as opposed to what I'm actually trying to say.
Okay, well, do you justify rights as coming from God?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, then we're fine there. But so I think we actually agree. So then, if that is the case, if whatever you think rights are come from God, then whatever else we're appealing to external to God for where a right comes from isn't really a right, right? It's not really a right.
I think that life, goodness, creation, there is deep overlap. I think a simple way to look at it is, yin yang, within good there is some evil, within evil there is some good. Mm-hmm. And a way to explain that is sometimes we have to destroy to create. What does that mean? If there's a mass murderer who's murdering children, we don't want to, but we stop that person to defend ourselves and others' lives. I think that there is divine mandate that we must be fruitful, multiply. We are here to organize, to create. There's a secular way of looking at it. It's evolution that developed us into this point where we have internalized these things that we must do, or that result in a more efficient way of life. Or more simply, there is a God, there is a divine structure and mandate which results in certain things that are beneficial to mankind that I would describe as good and just, and there are things that are evil and unjust.
So as we get to the heart of it then, right here, where we come to this agreement, where I reject this, is that I think all the things you just stated are duties. They're duties. They're the opposite of rights. You have a duty.
I just think we're having a semantic argument.
Well, but semantics are super important so we don't speak past each other. So when I say a duty, it's an obligation to do a thing based on the fact that you're commanded to, in this case by God. A right, I would say, is an entitlement absent duty. So if that's the case, what you're listing out is like God is giving us these duties to do. I'm not sure what rights he's giving you.
I'm saying there are certain behaviors that God, that there are certain behaviors, there are certain functions of life that are a component of God's divine plan, mandate. And I could argue it in a secular way for people who don't believe in God or whatever.
Sure.
There's a natural structure of the universe that says to humans, be fruitful and multiply. And these things are important for the efficient structure of such.
Now, you could come at this from the secular evolutionary standpoint and say that I believe that rights exist based on evolution and what is beneficial for humanity. And now they're codified in the Constitution, so they exist on paper. And I would understand that position. However, with that worldview, you would still have to concede that they're simply constructions of the mind, social constructs that are based on our preferences, and they're not intrinsic or inalienable, but rather they're malleable and dependent on force, as we see the goalposts moved so often. But that was a very interesting exchange for sure. It's always exciting to challenge our presuppositions, especially ones that we hold very dear and that we don't challenge very often. Ones that tend to form our identity, our political identity, our national identity, etc. There's absolutely nothing wrong with doing that, even though it's challenging at times, but definitely makes us better thinkers. So with that, guys, hope you enjoyed this. Don't forget to leave a comment below. Let me know what you thought. I'd be interested to read all of your comments on this one. And also, my links will be just below there. And don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel if you'd like to watch another one right here. Till next time, I'm Jake. It's RattlesnakeTV, keeping you armed and dangerous.